This is Amy with Creative Catapult Coaching.
And Megan with Focus Like a Mother.
And as usual, Control Alt Think conversations with neurodivergent minds. We've thrown our topic out the window and are going a totally different direction. But we're focusing on connections and a lot of our ability to connect dots and see things, and then use that to leverage our knowledge base and our connections to do the things, whatever the things are.
All the things. I think the overarching theme, since we don't have like a really good name at the moment for our topic, um, the overarching theme is kind of, for me, it's thinking about the neurodivergent brain as like a web of information. And we've talked in the past about how the neurodivergent brains, all the different neurotypes in neurodivergence, like to seek out information. And it could be noticing everything around themselves. It could be very deep, special interests. It could be very broad, um, ever-changing interests and always finding something new and interesting. But all of these different perspectives are um, kind of fit within those of a neurodivergent kind of universe. Um, so I kind of look at it as the superpower of the neurodivergent brain is that no matter what all these different connections are, and if you've ever had a conversation with someone who has ADHD and you ping pong like five different topics, and then you're like, how did we get on this? But there's actually a path that got you there. Um,
Very much
because
so. And you know, at least in the ADHD umbrella, um, all humans think by association. It's not just neurodivergent. But there's a great strength that often gets highlighted with neurodivergence in pattern finding, and then with ADHD as well, we have lower thought inhibition, so we connect things without even thinking about it sometimes, which is where the inhibitory controls aren't as good, which is both that double-edged sword of where you blurt out something in the middle of class you didn't mean, but you can also, on the flip side, often, leverage that into really fabulous connections. And um, sort of this conversation started as I've been looking at my own energy management issues for a really long time. I'm picking up some other information that, yeah, I've got some pretty substantial energy limitations that I need to pay attention to in a different way. That being said, my next jump is, well, coaching is almost a zero energy output for me. Bookkeeping, billing, and things that I can totally do actually eat up more information processing by my brain. And right now, I kind of need to limit that, because even the cognitive stuff is apparently burning energy in a way that is making me real cranky, about the implications of it. And so I need to find a bookkeeper. I need to hand in, if I'm going to have more energy, I need to intentionally hand off some of the stuff that I can do, but I'm realizing I kind of need to protect my energy even more so than I've done for a long time. And so the superpower here is, I mentioned this to Megan, she's been having conversations with and knows a couple of bookkeepers in her network, but then also finding out that our conversations inadvertently, by sharing our information, are helping other people learn about the world around them and their
yeah.
neurodivergent perspective. So that was a very long string of conversation, how we got to today's topic.
Yeah, and I think for me, even before we started talking about energy management, I was talking about how my brain is currently fully absorbed in writing research papers. And so a large portion of my brain is currently occupied with facts, figures, research references, writing patterns, styles, um, and all of that. But one of the frustrating but also cool things about writing a research paper is that I think for one 2,000 word paper, so relatively short, it's like 7, 8 pages, 7 pages, something like that. I've got between 12 and 14 references, because I prefer to do things I prefer to use evidence-based approaches in my work with Focus Like a Mother. But in having, again, conversations with other people, this is something I didn't mention to Amy, is that I was venting to a friend who's an actual PhD and I mean, she has doctor in front of her name. Um, and I said, I don't know how you wrote your doctoral uh dissertation because I'm barely trying to write this, 7, 8 page paper, and I keep finding more connections and more things. And it's almost like my web of thoughts and ideas grows, and then I'm having to distill and distill. And she reassured me that that's a sign of good research and good writing. But it's also, so I know this friend of mine also has a lot of neurodivergent traits. So it's also a very cool superpower of neurodivergence is connecting all of those things. And as for the real life connections, just our conversations on this podcast, um, being able to help people who don't have experience with neurodivergent thinking personally or haven't realized that perspective, being able to share that or share things like energy management or uh, how we got to the end of a conversation, ping-ponging 6 different ways.
Right. Well, and that, the first filter that we were going to try and run this podcast through is how do we condense all of that related thought and information into a concise experience that you can convey in linear thought? Because when you go from a multi-dimensional conversation, I'm going to be super curious to see how this one gets summarized. And I use AI for that because my brain is tires easily. One of my bigger struggles is taking the soup of information I know and figuring out how and where to organize and start. We are
Yeah.
sort of all over today. This is probably one of the more focused, but more true to raw thinking of how a lot of us function in the world.
Yes. And it's interesting when you said the filter of um, getting it into linear thought, then my brain came back to, oh, that's what we're talking about here. Um,
We seem to be hitting on a whole lot of themes today. I'm not exactly
it's
sure.
it's all
But the
about
power of
connection, man.
connection
The
and connection
whole, yeah.
is kind of linear, but yeah, it's also kind of like a web. It's going to
Well,
be real interesting to see what gets made out of this ping-pongy conversation.
I think before we started the recording, I had said that I don't know if I said struggling, but one of my struggles with writing the research papers currently is taking my hot mess expressive thoughts of all these ideas, and I can see how these things might be connected, but now I've got to find and piece together the research and make the connections in a linear logical fashion, which logic I can do. Linear, um, like you, I'll use AI and say, hey, these are all the things I want to say. How do I put that into a better structure? Um, but when you said the multi-dimensional thinking, for me, that was validation of in the past in our coaching calls when I have brought myself and you have coached me through things. Uh, like 2 years ago when we first were getting to know each other. I think it's got to be
Yeah.
2 years ago because I was pregnant. Um, I would describe not being able to do work without like needing to use a computer screen feels restrictive to me because it doesn't have enough dimension. I have to spread everything out and I have trouble getting the ideas from my head onto a whiteboard or paper because it doesn't have, I can't take what I see in my head and make it work in the regular world. And now my brain is connecting that and saying, oh, it's multidimensional thinking versus being linear. And
Yeah,
so you were mentioning that in the term of networking and connecting your need with potentially someone that I know. So it's just interesting as our conversation has gone, we've hit all of these different points, but to you and I, they all have, you and I are following the reason and the logic. But we've
right.
also had these conversations for a few years now.
Yeah. Well, and part of what makes it interesting is that we both have enough similar thought patterns that we find this engaging and feed off of each other in this way. Some people are function differently and we have very different conversation styles. There are some people who look at me when I get into this kind of train of thought and have a just they just can't follow it. And that's fine because I can't follow half of their thinking either when they're in their excited phase. And I'm like, what? Anyway, so there's nothing wrong with having a different thinking style. And another point of superpower connection and problem solving and seeing a need and going out to fill it. Um, I'm sitting on a panel in a couple weeks speaking to neurodivergence and from a leadership and team perspective. And that's not my usual framing. So I'm reaching out to two or three different people just to talk about the questions that have been presented so that I can think about them. To me, this was a perfectly logical, next step is like, well, who in my network do I know? I've identified a couple people, had one of the several conversations, but several people were like, oh, that's really smart. What I wouldn't have thought of that. I'm like, but duh.
But yeah, it's thinking style, it's past experience. There's a lot of different things that play into um it's also bottom up. So that's one of our bottom up thinking and bottom up writing is another one of our topics. So I'm not going to dive into it, but
Right.
you just naturally want to find all the pieces so that then you can put them together. So naturally you're going out there going, well, I don't have the pieces, let me go find them.
Right. I can see the pieces I need to get to the outcome, which is, I want to be able to speak intelligently and reframe my knowledge about ADHD and into just an individual contributor up to kind of a team and leadership level. And not that I expect to nail it on the first time, but taking some other people's experience is really going to help me be able to reframe or restate what I know in a different fashion.
Hmm. Different context. Yeah. And my brain went back to AI. So before
Okay.
I make the jump, one of the things you could have done that a lot of people, so I go to a lot of local networking events and AI is a super hot topic. Um,
Both beloved and hated.
yes, both sides of the fence. But I sit somewhere cautiously in the middle, depends on what the AI is being used for. Um, But there are people that their first response would have been instead of what you're doing, it sounds like, is informational interviewing. So going actually and talking to people who have that context that you're missing so that you can plug in those pieces.
Hmm.
A lot of people have started doing informational interviewing type things with like ChatGPT or AI. So they'll um, go and just ask ChatGPT a question. How do I do this? So I could go ask ChatGPT a question. Um, what should I put in my email newsletter this month or whatever? Um, insert small business owner topic here. What I have learned
Well, and I think we
is
both have on this because we've
yes,
had a version of this conversation is how awfully wrong it can be.
Yes. So
especially
the
as an
people
expert.
that you're informational, the humans that you're going to informational interview with, you have sort of background vetted like their experience, right? So you know, oh, so and so has experience with such and such, and therefore this is a person I want information from. I believe that they'll give me a good perspective. ChatGPT or AI in general, um, gathers its information from everywhere. Um, and it's kind of hit or miss. It's
Right.
sort of a little crowdsourced. Um, it's sort of the whole premise of it is crowdsourced. But what I've found is um, I have to be really specific with, and in this case, I'm talking about ChatGPT specifically. There are some paid AI programs that will be more academic and evidence-based and have better vetted sources. But ChatGPT is kind of the go-to, like general, everybody just can go out and ask it questions. But I have fed it things from my research papers, or I've asked it, I've said, here's my draft, give me feedback. And then it'll say something. You and I had this conversation, Amy. I said, Amy, it's completely making references up, like out of thin air. So I have scoured Google Scholar for such and such reference that ChatGPT says is there, and this ish doesn't exist.
Yep.
Not there.
Yep.
So while I love the power of AI, especially for helping neurodivergent people, I'm putting that out there with a grain of salt. Be very careful and vet, just like you vet a person that you're going to ask,
Yeah.
question. And also, by the way, our human interaction, you take everything somebody else says with a grain of salt, right? So if someone gives you an answer that your brain is like, but this doesn't fit with all the other things that I'm finding, you kind of question it.
And again, that's part of that superpower of connecting dots and thinking about it. And it's an interesting piece of trust your gut or not. The tools are there, but you have to use them with a certain level of thought.
Well,
And
and
because
like,
even like me, running one of our literal transcripts through ChatGPT, I asked for quotes about something. It made up things we said in the podcast
mhm.
on the first pass. And I'm like, okay, tell me where that was. It's like at the beginning, this one's from the middle, and this one's at the end.
Yep. And
They
when you,
sounded like things we could have said, but they
yep.
weren't there.
Well, and I asked it, I told you this once, I asked it about my own business. I asked it to tell me about Focus Like a Mother, and it gave me correct information. And then it gave me a totally different founder and a totally different background that has nothing to do with me. And I started to panic. I was like, oh my gosh, is this out there on the internet somewhere? Um, but then when I asked it like where it got the information, it's like, oops, I made a mistake. This isn't right. And I was like, by the way, do you want the right information? Um, I have it because I'm
Yeah,
the person you're looking for.
right.
Um,
But yeah, it's
but it's kind
interesting.
of scary. And so I think it's really cool that you're asking people, right? And going to the connection of people first and that valid sources kind of thing first. Um, which brings us back to the whole superpower of connections, whether that's people connections or connecting topics or noticing details in different connections.
Yeah. Well, and for me too, noticing when I hadn't even thought about running questions through ChatGPT until right now. But also knowing that that would have been less energy involved, which right now being I'm on an energy not hyper aware, but pretty close to hyper aware. What am I doing with my energy? Um, and talking to people in some ways feels really good and is energizing. In other ways, is draining. And so this is actually much higher energy cost to me to get to get accurate information, but is totally worth it.
Well, and it's the same for instance, writing a research paper. It's way more work to actually read all of the references that are going into, or at least look through them enough to know like this paper is about what I want, or like I have a few that it's like there isn't research on what I want. So what can I find of the research that has been done and what conclusions have they come to? Um, but it's so much easier to use ChatGPT, so it doesn't surprise me. And it's a great tool for some things. Um, but it's interesting also because my defenses are almost down in terms of my BS meter with it a lot of times because it's very convincing. So it's like it gives you stuff,
Yeah.
and I'm like, wow, really? Where did I didn't get that from this paper or this article. Where did you find that? And I'm like looking and I'm going in like the search PDF version, like where is this specific claim? It's not in there at all.
Yeah. And I think,
Like this doesn't exist.
well, and I think we can maybe draw another interesting connection that, connect, meta level connection, a connection that the connections ChatGPT makes aren't the same ones that we would make as humans, and that, the human ones still have a lot of value and are energy intensive in a different way than ChatGPT or any other AI is. And it's all tools. Pick your context wisely.
Yes. Which brings me back full circle. Sorry, everybody, we're just all over the place. Uh,
But
full circle on the AI thing. So one cool thing that I like to use AI in general for. So I use Grammarly. I have a paid account to Grammarly because um for those that don't know, my undergrad is in engineering, and the joke is that engineers don't need to write. That's what spell check is for. Grammarly is like spell check beefed with AI. Um, so it it tells me when I do things that my English and writing teachers would have just absolutely
not like,
cringed at. But um, yeah, my husband, who's also an engineer, kind of jokes about English is our first language, but we're not very good at it. Um, but I will use both Grammarly and other AI tools to review my writing. So I will ask it, like, are there any gaps? I will ask it, like, pretend that you are, and then describe my ideal audience for this presentation, paper, blog post, whatever it is. And I'll say, um, where are there opportunities? Where are there gaps? How does this article come across? And so in that case, I like that it gives me a different perspective, but not when I'm asking it like to cite specific sources. I'm more asking it like, what kinds of information are people looking for on this specific topic? And then in which case it's sort of looking at Google results and search results on things, and these are the things that people are gravitating to. And so then I can make the logical inference of, oh, okay, and it gives me a different perspective because I don't know anything outside of my own perspective. And we've talked before about how being a solopreneur is like living and working in a bubble. I use AI to help see outside of my bubble, which I really like. But again, then I can take it like it's a person giving me, feedback, and I can take it with a grain of salt. If it'll give me 5 suggestions on places I could improve my writing or whatever thing I'm working on, a lot of times 2 to 3 of them are things I actually might want to consider looking at. And the other, at least 2 of them, I'm like, oh, I don't know about that.
yeah. So let's
So,
come maybe back up to connections and superpower and then wrap up.
yes, close us out, Amy.
So, yeah, it'll be interesting to see where this one goes. This really turned into a rabbit hole discussion that was not quite where we started. So, uh, that's all right. And we have superpowers that can often lead us in really interesting directions. And it's kind of fun to go down and explore them and see where we go. But where do your superpowers lead you? Is the question I'll lead out with.
Hmm. That's a really great question, and I'd like to see what people have to say. So maybe we can get some comments on this episode.
It means I'd have to enable comments.
Oh, well.
There's that. But I'm Amy with Creative Catapult Coaching,
And I'm Megan with Focus Like a Mother.
and this is episode 17,
Well,
I think, if I'm recording. Anyway, we'll see you next time.
bye.